Welcome to another episode of the Riffle, a podcast series brought to you by 10 Leaves. Today we're diving deep into some really fascinating new developments coming out of the Abu Dhabi global market. That's ADGM, of course. We're specifically looking at their updated data protection regulations. In this world, just absolutely swimming in data, understanding how our sensitive personal information gets handled. Well, it's not just important anymore, is it? It feels absolutely critical. So for this deep dive, we're really zeroing in on these recently enacted rules, the data protection regulations, substantial public interest conditions, Rules 2025. Our mission really is to understand what these new rules actually mean. Why are they so significant, especially for sectors like, say, insurance or education? And crucially, how do they offer better protection for vulnerable individuals? It's all about getting to the heart of how EDGM is trying to strike that balance, balancing innovation with really robust safeguards. Okay, let's unpack this. Before we get right into the weeds of these new rules, maybe let's just take a quick step back. Let's frame this. ADGM's growth has been, well, pretty phenomenal. We're not talking about just any financial hub here. This is a premier international destination, and the growth figures are quite something. Did you know ADGM is now the anime region's largest international financial center? They had, 11,128 active licenses at the end of the first half of 2025. And here's a real eye-opener, a 245% growth in assets under management just in 2024. That's staggering.
It really is. And that kind of growth at scale, it naturally necessitates very strong frameworks underpinning it all. What's fascinating, I think, is how ADGM actively positions itself. They talk about being the perfect platform for success. And that's not just about shiny buildings or fast internet. It's built on these progressive legal frameworks, this future-focused infrastructure. Fundamentally, it's about building trust, isn't it, on a global scale?
Exactly, trust.
And a huge part of that trust comes from having a strong, independent legal jurisdiction.
Right.
And crucially for our conversation today, a clear and importantly adaptable data protection framework. The 2021 regulations already laid that groundwork, of course.
Right.
But their ongoing commitment seems to be about maintenance and evolution. Keeping it aligned internationally, think principles like GDPR, but also making sure it's responsive to, societal needs as they change. It's not just a static document set in stone. It has to be a living system.
And that dynamic responsiveness, that's exactly what brings us to the update we're focusing on today. So let's get to it. The Registration Authority of ADGM has amended the 2021 regulations. They've introduced these data protection regulations, substantial public interest conditions, Rules 2025, the substantial public interest rules. These were enacted actually just today. It followed a whole process, consultation paper number 6 of 2025, all very thorough. And they were published September 9th, 2025. This isn't just a minor tweak, is it? Feels more significant.
Oh, absolutely. It's a significant refinement. These new rules, they provide much-needed clarity, specifically on processing what are called special categories of personal data, and doing so under very specific public interest grounds.
Okay, break that down a bit. Special categories, what exactly falls under that?
Right, so special categories of personal data. This is the really sensitive stuff. Think health data, maybe religious beliefs, biometric data like fingerprints or facial recognition, information that if it got into the wrong hands or was misused could seriously harm an individual.
Okay. Highly sensitive. And the substantial public interest part.
That refers to situations where there's a compelling societal need, a strong reason related to the public good that might require processing this sensitive data, sometimes even without the person's explicit consent, but always under very strict, carefully defined conditions. That's the key. So these new rules really drill down into what those conditions actually are and where they apply, particularly in key sectors like insurance and education. And they're benchmarked against global best practices, aiming for that high standard. It's really about enabling necessary functions while, minimizing risk as much as possible.
Okay, purpose clear. Handling the super sensitive stuff under specific public interest grounds, but, the proof is always in the pudding, isn't it? How does this actually play out? Let's take insurance. I mean, insurers constantly need sensitive personal data, right? To assess risk, handle claims, manage policies. But that obviously opens up huge privacy concerns. So how do these new regulations sort of walk that tightrope?
That's precisely where the detail in these rules becomes so important. They establish very clear conditions for insurance companies. Conditions for processing special categories of personal data, but only where that processing is necessary for a defined insurance purpose and serves a substantial public interest. It needs both.
And they define insurance purpose.
They do, quite comprehensively, to avoid any gray areas. An insurance contract covers general, long-term, or reinsurance. Straightforward enough. And insurance purpose is quite broad but specific. It covers things like advising on, arranging, underwriting, or administering an insurance contract. Also includes administering a claim under a contract, or, say, exercising a right or complying with an obligation related to that contract, maybe something required by law. So it really tries to cover the necessary operational scope for insurance to function.
Okay, that makes sense. Covers the bases.
But here's where it gets particularly nuanced, especially regarding consent. The rules address situations where processing might happen without explicit consent. Now, this is carefully limited. It applies if the processing isn't directly for measures or decisions against the individual, the data subject, and if that person isn't expected to suddenly get new rights or obligations because of this processing related to the contract.
Right, so not if it negatively impacts them directly without consent.
Exactly. And if those conditions are met, then processing without consent can happen, but only under two further conditions. First, the controller, that's the insurance company in this case, the one deciding how and why to process the data, cannot reasonably be expected to get consent. Think practical impossibility, perhaps. And second, the controller must not be aware that the data subject has actively withheld their consent.
Actively withheld. What does that mean in practice?
Good question. The rules clarify that simply not responding to a request for consent doesn't count as actively withholding it. So if they ask and you just don't reply, that doesn't automatically block necessary processing under these specific public interest grounds. You generally need to explicitly say no. It's a very practical distinction, trying to balance the need for services to function with individual control. Imagine a major disaster scenario. Contacting thousands for consent might be impossible or severely delay critical actions.
That level of detail is, yeah, it's absolutely crucial for individuals to know their rights, but also for companies operating there to know the boundaries. It really clarifies those edge cases. Okay, so moving on from the commercial side, like insurance, these rules also cast a really important protective net over perhaps an even more sensitive area, safeguarding children and individuals considered at risk. This feels like where the regulations really show their ethical core. What's the mechanism here? How do they allow for protection without just overriding privacy rights?
Yes, this is a hugely important part of the update, very ethically driven. The condition allowing processing here is if it's genuinely necessary to protect an individual. That could be protection from neglect, or physical, mental, or emotional harm, or just protecting their general well-being. And it covers both protecting a specific person and protecting categories of individuals who might be vulnerable. It's a broad protective aim.
Who falls under this protection?
Specifically individuals under 18 years old. And also adults, those 18 or over, who are determined to be at risk. And that at-risk definition for adults is quite precise, which is important. It's not arbitrary. It applies if the controller, say, a social services body has reasonable cause to suspect three things. One, the individual needs care and support. Two, they are experiencing or at risk of neglect or harm, physical, mental, or emotional. And three, this is crucial, as a result of those needs, they are unable to protect themselves from that neglect or harm or the risk of it.
So it requires that inability to self-protect.
Yes, that's a key part of the definition. It ensures the focus is on genuine vulnerability, where intervention might be necessary. Now, the mechanism you asked about how processing can happen without consent in these cases. There are three specific circumstances laid out. First, if consent simply cannot be given by the data subject, perhaps due to their condition or circumstances. Second, if the controller cannot reasonably be expected to obtain that consent. Again, practicality might play a role. And third, and this one is really critical for effective protection, if actually seeking consent would prejudice the provision of the necessary protection.
So trying to get consent might actually make things worse or delay help.
Precisely. Imagine a situation where asking for consent could alert an abuser or delay urgent medical or welfare intervention. This allows for necessary action in those critical moments. H.E. Rashed Al-Blushi, the CEO of the Registration Authority at ADGM, put it quite well. He said, let me find the quote. Here. ADGM's data protection framework is built on the principles of accountability, transparency, and public trust. Okay. He continued, these new rules reinforce our commitment to protecting individuals, particularly the most vulnerable, while enabling responsible data use across sectors. Quote, we remain focused on ensuring our regulations evolve in line with both global standards and local needs. That quote really captures the dual aim, doesn't it? Strong protection, but also enabling responsible data use where it's truly needed for the public good.
It really does. And hearing that quote, it underscores that these aren't just abstract rules, they have real-world impact. It seems clear these amendments are a significant and hopefully very positive step forward. And it's not just for the specific sectors like insurance or social care we've talked about. It also supports ADGM's own expansion, right?
Yeah.
Like including Alrime Island in its jurisdiction now. It feels like part of building the infrastructure for that growth and ensuring robust protections keep pace. It's about handling that tricky balance in a modern growing economy.
Absolutely. If you connect the dots, look at the bigger picture. These rules are, I think, a sophisticated attempt.
Yeah.
An attempt to clarify exactly when these special sensitive categories of data can be processed for this thing called substantial public interest. What this does is provide a much-needed layer of legal certainty. Businesses in vital sectors get clearer guidelines. It allows them to provide essential services insurance, maybe aspects of education, healthcare links, while also rigorously protecting individuals' most sensitive information. And crucially, it gives social services clearer grounds for intervention to protect the vulnerable.
So legal certainty for businesses, better protection for individuals.
Yes, that seems to be the goal. It really speaks to ADGM's wider commitment, doesn't it? Creating an environment that empowers the future, as they might say, but doing so by carefully balancing necessary data processing with safeguarding that sensitive information.
Yeah.
And importantly, doing it in a way that aligns with global standards, like the GDPR principles we mentioned. It shows they're thinking internationally and responsively.
It certainly seems like a very considered approach.
It does, but, it also raises a really important question for all of us looking beyond ADGM. In our increasingly data-driven world, how effectively can different places, different jurisdictions really define and then consistently apply this concept of substantial public interest? How do we make sure essential services can be delivered, innovation can happen, but without chipping away at individual privacy and safety? It's a tough balance, and defining substantial public interest is right at the heart of that challenge. It's something that's likely to become even more complex as technology evolves.
That really is the core challenge, isn't it? And one that regulators everywhere are wrestling with. So just to recap our deep dive today, ADGM's new Substantial Public Interest Rules 2025, they bring much needed clarity. Clarity on processing sensitive personal data. They set out specific practical conditions for sectors like insurance, and they establish robust, ethically grounded protections for children and adults considered at risk. It really does look like a clear demonstration of ADGM's commitment, trying to achieve a balanced, internationally aligned, and pretty responsive data protection framework. Which brings us to that final thought for you, our listener. As this digital landscape keeps shifting under our feet and data becomes ever more foundational to, well, everything, how do you think regulatory bodies can best adapt? How can they protect individuals effectively while still fostering innovation and enabling those crucial public services? It's a complex, ongoing challenge and one we'll all definitely continue to grapple with. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. This has been another deep dive in the Riffle, a podcast series brought to you by 10 Leaves.